All right, I'm going to move on now for the next speaker. I'm going to do a short little context here. I first came to Australia in 2010 to premiere DMT, The Spirit Molecule, the film. And as soon as I arrived, I met some amazing people and started just a wonderful journey from Melbourne all the way up the coast. And I started hearing about Darpan. I didn't know who Darpan was, and I never got to meet Darpan. I finally had the opportunity to meet this guy before, I guess it was at Rainbow Serpent this year. But there was this myth and this legend about Darpan. I was like, man, I want to meet this guy. So I finally had that opportunity, and I can't say how much I'm thrilled to be able to introduce him tonight. And this wasn't a bio that he wrote up. It's just something I was sitting here thinking about from what I've heard and also what I've experienced from Darpan. Like I said, I met him just earlier this year. And had this legend going around. But what I came to was this magical musician, this singing alchemist, a meta-dimensional navigator, an illuminated character, and a smile that's going to heal any hardened heart. So it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce Darpan for a wonderful experience. Let's give him a round of applause.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Mitch. I only hope I can live up to that kind of an introduction. And I'd like to thank Steve also for your wonderful and informative speech. Thank you, Steve. The talk I'd like to give tonight is very much an anecdotal, and I want to tell a few stories because in my life, I feel that this magical ambrosia, this medicine that derives from the jungles of South America and has been used across Pan-Amazonia by most of the indigenous peoples that live within the jungle, utterly swept me away when I met her, when I met the medicine. And so I'd just like to give a little bit of a talk about how that happened. And so it's a bit of an adventure story, and in the meantime, I hope that I can also impart some useful information. And but very much, this is not so much a scientific talk as much as an anecdotal and an entertainment in a certain sense, or an infotainment, if you like. And so I'd like to start at the beginning, where when I was about 16, 17, I went to university. I went to Flinders University in South Australia after finishing a fairly dreadful secondary education. I mean, I stayed at school just so that I could leave home, actually. I hated school, but I knew that it was my ticket out of there if I could actually, get a scholarship to go to university. So I stayed for that reason, just so I could leave home. It wasn't so much home that I was wanting, dissatisfied with. It was just the stultification of the little small town in which I grew up, which was actually beautiful as a child, because I was greatly imbued and deeply affected by nature. I grew up on the River Murray in South Australia, which is like the River Nile to this country. It cuts an oasis through fairly arid desert regions, and it was a magical childhood that I had growing up on this river, and I feel very blessed to have been able to grow up in an area like that. But by the time I was about 13, I was scheming, how do I get out of this place, because it was a very, very small town. And so I got to university, and I started to study psychology and the theatre studies. And that was an eventful time, because when I got to university, I came across many things that opened up my eyes in new ways. Number one, I came across marijuana. I mean, you couldn't get marijuana anywhere in Australia in those days except for at universities. It was largely unknown in the country. And so I was starting to mix and meet with people who were really opening me up, really lifting the blinkers that I'd kind of grown up with, and opening up my mind and my spirit and my being in new ways. That was very exciting and very stimulating and inspiring. And I'd heard about this substance called LSD, and so I was trying to find it everywhere. I was like, is anybody got any LSD? I want to try this stuff. And I'd read about all the negative press about it, that it made you go blind, that it gave you made you have to form children, jump out of windows, all of that sort of stuff. But nonetheless, I was not to be deterred, because something in me, there was some deep feeling And I thought, yeah, there's something here for me. And eventually, of course, I did come across it, and it was amazing, that first trip that I took, which was very beautifully kind of guided by one of my friends who became one of my closest friends, who was a serious tripper at the time. And so he took me to nature and had a very, very positive experience. And the experience I remember when I first had it was that, this is home. I know this space. This space is so familiar to me. And regardless of all of the negative, publicity around it, I just felt this is really beneficial. It's good for me, and I just, started working with it very, very regularly. In fact, we used to have this. Every Wednesday we'd go up into my parents' property. He had my father had a holiday house up in the Adelaide Hills, and me and my friends, usually 2 or 3 of us at a time, would take the LSD in nature and just have the most profound experiences and wonderful bonding between the people who I was tripping with, and so like basically I started to explore the psychedelics from about age 17 onwards. And my attention was immediately garnered then after that by the mushroom experience, and I was interested in mescaline, although I couldn't find it. I found a botanist at Flinders University who told me all about the San Pedro experience, which is the Trichocereus pachanoi cactus, which most of you are probably familiar with, and so I was very, very interested in trying that too. And he said, "Look, I'll take you to the botanical gardens. I know exactly where it's growing." So I went there, and the specimen that he was looking for had been hacked, probably by very enthusiastic hippies who no longer existed there. So I was very disappointed. I thought, oh no. He said, "Look, we'll look around." And he looked around, and he found this other cactus. He said, "Look, I'll stake my botanist's reputation on the fact that this is Trichocereus pachanoi." It wasn't marked. So I took it home. I didn't know how to prepare it, so I just got a blender and blended it all up in the blender and sat there with my friend, looking at this green, viscous, phlegm-like, substance, trying to build up the courage to drink it. And, we were having some big fat joints of Queensland heads just to sort of build up our courage to do it. And so, eventually we got to drink this stuff, and it went down my throat, and it was sort of in my stomach and in my mouth at the same time, and joined with this sort of glutinous string of phlegm and it was just like, and I was trying my best not to throw it up, held it down, and we waited around, and an hour later we're going, "Feel anything?" I said, yeah, I think I am. But an hour and a half, 2 hours later, we had to admit nothing was happening except for the fact that we were very, very stoned. And so, that was my first experience of San Pedro, and I didn't actually have another attempt until many years later, and then I had the real McCoy, and it was absolutely benign, very, very wonderful, and very, very kind and very informative teacher plant. And I've continued to use that plant ever since that day. But, so these intelligence agents, which is how Leary termed them, the late and great Timothy Leary, who was one of my heroes actually at school, and as was Dr. John Lilly. I'd read all of his books, and I was very, very heavily influenced by Leary and Lilly both, and he referred to them as intelligence agents, and I think that was a very, very good term to use, because I think these things have become like evolutionary drivers. Like LSD in the 60s was like a depth charge into the collective unconscious, which affected everybody, not just the people who took it, because a whole new language came into the society, a whole new way of being, a way of looking at things. Even I remember cars were fairly drab up until the 60s. They were either grey or brown or green. And suddenly there was like red, yellow. Colour became a large part of our experience as a result of that collective experience. So I think that although not everybody took LSD, a significant portion of the collective did. And in so doing, it affected the whole collective of humanity. And that was a very chaotic depth charge. And there were a lot of casualties along the road, because it was all fairly chaotic. We were taking it at festivals and, in situations that you normally wouldn't do. Even though we had Tim saying set and setting is absolutely important. And from my own point of view, I always observed that. And I, to this day, maintain that it's an absolute guideline that must be observed. Because the set, which is the physical place in which you take it, and the setting, which is which is the setting, which is the physical place you take, the set, which is your mindset, what you bring to it, certainly with any psychedelic or any psychoactive substance, largely influences the result. So I think that the 60s was fairly chaotic, and a lot of people, put Tim Leary down because they say, well, he unleashed it sort of indiscriminately onto the populace, and that it should have been kept for study with, scientists, doctors of divinity, and so on. And so that's why Aldous Huxley said he should be kept for a certain elite. However, if that were true, myself and most of you would probably never have come across the experience, and it certainly changed my life. And it put me on a path to want to really explore these substances from a very subjective point of view, at the same time going to deep research, reading everything I could about it, any material or any literature on the subject, I devoured it. And so in my first early years, LSD was my teacher. It was definitely the thing that I was using a lot, and with great benefit. I never really ever I had some pretty horrendous and hairy journeys, but on the whole, they were pretty positive and pretty good, and I really did benefit from them. But then I came across a guy called Dr. Stanislav Grof, who most of you will probably be familiar with, in the work that he's done with the birth perinatal matrices, which was like a map, a BPM, what he called the BPMs 1, 2, 3, and 4, which were like stages or maps of the psychedelic territory or the kind of topography that you could explore within these intelligence agents. And that was a fantastic discovery. And, I became really, really intrigued by the work of Dr. Stanislav Grof and by the work that he was doing with where he was getting his clients and the people he was working with mega doses, like between 500 to 1,500 mics of LSD in one sitting. And, I think the average dose at that time, which was quite a strong dose, was 250 mics. These days on a dance floor, you probably get about 100 mics. But when we were doing these experiments, I was doing it with a friend, we would sit for each other. And basically I would put on a blindfold, a doona, take this, usually it was between 750 to 1,000 mics, and then just go deep within the experience. And the sitter, would just sit there and make sure that nobody would be answered. The phone wouldn't ring, and you wouldn't have to have the responsibility of answering that. Nobody would knock at the door. If you needed anything, they'd be there to help you. And so you entered the blindfold and entered deep into the interiority of one's own experience. And that was absolutely amazing. That was a turning point for me because, suddenly I saw that this was such an incredible tool. So it was like suddenly discovering a microscope, and being able to look at the entirety of one's own being. In fact, when you took that kind of a dose and sat there, I didn't have a sensory deprivation tank. I'd read, The Center of the Cyclone by Dr. John Lilly, and in that he'd done accounts of his own experiences and own experiments with LSD inside of a sensory deprivation tank. So I simulated it as best I could with a doona and a headphone and just going in that way. And the results were absolutely amazing, like they were so deep. And, you'd forget that you were in the experience. You'd forget that you were an ego, it was a totally ego-shredding experience. You'd forget that you were Darpan that had taken LSD, that was in this situation where somebody was sitting for you. You just go deep, deep inside. And I remember experiencing myself as a point of consciousness that was definitely a finite point of awareness, but it was expanded to include everything in the universe. And from that point of awareness, I could explore and travel and journey into, and I learned how to navigate through intention into all kinds of information that's stored within the phylogenetic memories of the DNA, that's stored within the deep recesses of the reptilian and the midbrain and the forebrain. The brain and our body, I started to realize, was just an incredible tool, this incredible gift that we're born with, this body, which is capable of holding so much information and so much deep memory from everything from the single-cell protozoa up to our experience now. So that was my early experience. And I was lucky enough to meet Leary one day. He came to talk to Sydney. He came to talk on artificial intelligence. And he was talking at a hotel where he was doing a stand-up philosophers act and reading from his book Flashbacks. And he was 76 or something at the time, and I thought, wow, if I could be like that when I'm 76, I'll be very, very happy. He seemed like a very wonderful, rascal. He seemed like, one of those Irish rascals. And so when he came afterwards, he was just, fraternizing with people in the bar. I walked up behind him and I just tapped him on the shoulder and I said, he didn't turn around, I just whispered in his ear, I said, Tim, I just want to thank you for being such a light in my life. And he turned around and gave me this incredibly big smile, and we hugged, and there was all that needed to say. I just was so happy to have just touched his life in that moment. And we had a bit of more of a chat, but it was all in that look, it was all in that, that moment. And so I was very fortunate, and also very fortunate to meet at another stage Dr. John Lilly, who was here talking on dolphin into cetacean intelligence. And a friend of mine was kind of his minder. And I said, oh, please, can you find a time for me to meet him? I'd love to meet this man. And so one night I got a call and said, quick, come down. Don't bring anybody. I've got John here. You can come down and meet him. So I walked in to this house, which was in Hopetown Avenue, somewhere in a very posh part of Sydney. And there was this man sitting naked on a chair. And he looked, he had this look in his eye, and so I sat down next to him, and on the way there I had all these questions that I thought I wanted to ask him, and when I got there they all dissolved away in the presence of this man, and I just sat with him and just didn't say anything. We just sat, and I was just feeling into him, and I could really feel that pioneer spirit that he is, that he was, that inquiring mind, and I was just, and then eventually we got to talking, and he got up, and he was kind of really shaky, and I thought, wow, he's quite, infirm. He was a bit doddery, like he was also in his 70s. It was only later, many years later, in India, when I had my first experience with ketamine, that I realized what was happening, that he was on ketamine that night. In fact, he was in the middle of writing the book The Scientist, which is an account of his experiments as ketamine. So that was also a very, very strong influence on my life. And he was the one who said to me, reality is for people who can't handle drugs. Anyway, from there on, I continued a lot of experiences with the LSD, and I started to run these transpersonal experiences for a lot of my friends, which usually involved a 2-day experience where one day we'd just sit down and we'd talk about all the transference issues that could come up, where he had, being the person who take the LSD, might see the sitter at different points as the devil or as God or as any number of other kind of things, and talked about projection and transference so they'd be familiar with that terrain, and to be able to just let go and just surrender to the experience. And then we'd actually have the experience, which would last for about 12 hours or something, and then after that we'd get a whole lot of paper and just draw mandalas, still no talking through the whole experience, and just draw mandalas and express the experience through art. And then after that we'd have a really big meal to ground, and then, delicious meal, and then we'd just spend hours rapping and just downloading what happened. And this was my kind of interest and my hobby and my work, actually, for a number of years. But it was when I was at university early on, when I was writing, it was not really a thesis, it was for my honours degree in transpersonal psychology. I wrote a paper called Consciousness Expansion and the Nature of Religious Experience, which, despite its formidable title, was actually a dissertation on looking at the common experiential aspects of various pathways to what we call enlightenment. And I was looking at Sufism, Tantra, Tao, Zen, and psychedelics. And it was during this time, in my early 20s, that I came across a book, and I can't remember the author, it was called Keep the River on Your Right, which mentioned ayahuasca. And I remember when I read about ayahuasca, I thought, something came in me, something lit up, and I thought, I'm going to be using that substance, that teacher, that intelligence agent at some point, And I had no idea when, because it was in South America, and it was the first time I'd ever read about it. I didn't really know much about it. Nobody else knew much about it, but it was just there, that first instance, and so, it wasn't until many, many years later, in fact, about 20 to 23 years later, where in the meantime I'd been working as an actor, working as a musician, working as a therapist, putting on all these different hats at different points. And I always thought, well, I'm not any of those things. I'm not really an actor. I'm not really a musician. I'm not really a therapist, although I'm happy doing them. I'm having lots of fun doing these things. But I always thought, what's my purpose? I couldn't ever really answer that, and I couldn't answer that for myself. But I was just happy, having a good time, basically. I fell in love with an actress, so I went to the theatre for 12 years. Then I worked in movies, and at the same time, always keeping the practice of using psychedelics. That was my main interest all the way through every other so-called career thing that I was doing. And it wasn't until I was about 40, 44, something like that, that I came across the writings of Terence McKenna. And the first book I read was The Archaic Revival, which made a huge impact on me. And of course, here was the subject of ayahuasca suddenly in front of me on the table again. And I was very interested in this subject, so I started to call together a study group of some friends who were also interested. And about 9 of us would get together every few weeks or a month and just have a chat, a discussion. We'd have a forum, like a tutorial with each other, and each of us would bring reading material or information or anecdotal information or scientific information about ayahuasca. And we were kind of like really invoking the spirit of ayahuasca without realizing it at the time. And one of my friends, Sahajo, I think is in here in the audience somewhere tonight, who had met Terence at Esalen Institute, said, why don't we invite Terence over and so he can really learn from this man. And I remember looking at the book and seeing his picture and looking in his eye and going, I know that man, I know that look, I know that feeling, he feels like a brother, So I felt already an affinity with him, but I didn't feel at all good about inviting him. I said, no, he's probably way too busy, he's probably, got a million other things to do, he wouldn't want to come to Australia just to hang out. He said, well look, I used to know him, I'll write him an email. So he did. And Terence wrote back and said, I'd be delighted, absolutely, when, and let's organise it. And so we did, we went ahead with it. And, that humble invitation then turned out to become, once people had realised that Terence McKenna was coming to Australia, it went into the hands of promoters and other people who then went, no, let's do a national tour and da-da-da-da. But nonetheless, he came to stay with us for the first couple of weeks of his entry into Australia. And during that time, that was definitely a very big formative time for me. And I'm so grateful to this man. I mean, we're all grateful to this man, but just personally, on a personal level, he activated something in me that has just, spawned the most incredible pathway in my life. I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams the kind of pathway that has opened up for me. And I really have to say that Terence was the one that initiated me. He was my first maestro. Because when we met and we had lots of discussions, he was staying in my house and we were doing groups and organising things for him and stuff, he said, look, I'll send you this ambrosia, this substance in the mail, and indeed he did. And so I started to get these little brown bottles in the mail, and they had all cleverly marked, and he'd say this was the standard dose and this is the heroic dose. And so of course I went for the heroic dose, and I was just very fortunate. For the next 2 years I was able to really have a deep darshan with the mother, and really I had no interest in giving it to people or anything like that. I was just interested in exploring it, and so I was doing it at a fairly regular basis with a couple of friends here and there, but mostly alone. And I was still reading all the material on shamanism, on ayahuasca shamanism, Amazonian shamanism, and realized that if you felt called, that it was traditional for shamanic election to do a dieta, which is a very specialized condition where one takes kind of a vow of celibacy and undertakes a diet, a regimen of eating very, very plain food, very sattvic food, just rice, some boiled vegetables or boiled plantains, and just staying on this diet and not having, intercourse with anybody, not seeing anybody, and basically being in nature and staying there and drinking the medicine, if not every day, every second day. And so after a period of time of working with these plants, I really felt a calling for this, and so I decided to do this. I decided to impose a dieta upon myself. I had no shaman that I knew of. I hadn't been to South America, So I imposed those conditions upon myself. And so for 3 months, because I'd just broken up with my girlfriend, I had never tried celibacy before, but I thought I'll give it a go. And then, I had a friend, Russell, who was my local leprechaun, Russell Hibbs, who's this amazing, Russell. He's an amazing storyteller, songwriter, bard. He's a bard in the old tradition of the old medieval bards, and he really embodies this. And so he was living on my property, and he would make sure nobody would see me, and I had only contact with him. And so, I was drinking this from these brown bottles every second day for 3 months. And look, it was the most extraordinary opening. It was just like, in between that time, just to digress a little, I'd been to Pune. I'd been with my spiritual master, a guy called Osho, in India. And every morning and every night, he would deliver discourses that were just sublime. And every morning or night, he would end the discourse by going, "Enough for today." Well, it was just like that with this medicine. I'd drink the medicine, and I would open up into this world. It was like being taken on a David Attenborough, one of those nature programs that he would do, and the medicine was showing me as a disembodied eye, would take me into the telluric worlds. Like you spend a week just on the mineral world, introducing to all the mineral spirits, the minerals of the world, going into the subterranean depths and the world of crystals. And every day, just like Osho, after the journey, it'd be almost like enough for today. And then the next journey, and the next day, or the day after the next day, it would pick it up just where it left off and take it further. And this is like a holographic learning. When you're looking at a book, you're looking at two-dimensional writing, and you're, decoding all of that in your brain as meaning. But this was like being presented as it was a living language. It was like a living library. It was like, I guess, the opening up to the Akashic records, where all this information was being presented to me in full three-dimensional holographic tutorials. And then it would go into the plant world for a week. Then it would go into the world of humans. Then it would go into the galactic level, beyond the humans, into realms that I couldn't really imagine. And I was seeing things that I couldn't really recognize, and it would show me the whole sequence of evolution on this planet, from the beginnings of the single cell protozoa through all of the forms, all of the lichens and the plant forms, all of the fish forms and the oceans and the amphibians. And it would show me all of the ways that the insects developed, and then the ways that the mammals developed, and then into humans, and then even beyond humans into forms that I couldn't recognize, that I guess are still to come. And so I was being downloaded with all this stuff, and a lot of the time I'd be going, wow, can I really, is this for real, or is this my imagination, or can I really trust this stuff, But I didn't have anybody but myself there, so I was going into this kind of almost schizophrenic state, where everything that I was seeing was meaningful. The way a leaf would fall from the tree, the way, stones would fall if you threw them on the ground, was meaningful. Everything seemed, the interpenetration of the worlds and the interpenetrations of the dimensions into this moment seemed so real, and it was so finite, so, you could touch it, smell it, feel it. And it was so interconnected, that whole multi-dimensional thing was so present. And so I was getting a little bit into my world, and not having, the only person I was downloading this was with Russell. So he was getting all of this, and so, but fortunately holding me in that space, and without commenting on whether it was right or wrong or this or that. And I just share with him, and then what happened? Towards the end of the dieta, the 3 months, this extraordinary things happened. And I remember reading in The Invisible Landscape, which was Dennis's and Terence's book, which I was reading at the time, that the election of a shaman, there's often traditional ways in which this happens. And one can be through a near-death experience. Another can be through surviving a very, very strong illness in which you heal yourself and then become, as the wounded healer, able to heal others. Another one is through, generation. Your father is a shaman, he passes it on to you. But yet another way was the appearance of a magical animal, or the appearance of something into the physical realm that was very significant that affected you very strongly. And that's exactly what happened to me, because I remember towards the end of this whole experience, the medicine said to me, now you can share this with just a few of your friends. You know, just share it with a few of your friends. So I was thinking to do that. And so I was also doing a lot of research on the local acacias at the time. And so I couldn't get chacruna, which is Psychotria viridis, the DMT-containing additive to the ayahuasca potion. And I could get the acacia. So I started to experiment, and I went and harvested some. And in fact, I was making my first brew this one day, and I was just at home, and it was about midnight, and I was listening to one of Terence's tapes where he was talking about the brewing, and it was about midnight, and I heard this wah. I thought, fuck, what's that? You know, like, and I went upstairs into my balcony because it seemed to be coming from up there, and I went up. There's nothing there. Then I walked back down the stairs, and there, because I had lived in this A-frame and this kind of like cross beams, was this owl. And it was this owl that was just going, wah, wah, looking at me. I went, wow, welcome, thank you, you know, come in, you know. And I went and sat down on the table. And then I'd been lying down on the couch with my head back, listening to Terence's tape. Then went and sat at the table, and he just flew straight down where my head had been on the couch, sort of seemed to be grokking the area there, and then flew straight over to me on the table in front of me, that far away, and started to go, woo, 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 woo. I'm going, right, okay. And these birds are amazing. They have binocular vision. Like most birds see two images, and so they have to stick their head that way, you know, to see you properly. The owl can hold your vision, hold your gaze, just as a human being can. I mean, try it with a dog or a cat, and they'll look away after a moment. They'll get nervous. But this owl could hold my gaze. So I started toning to it. I was going, just playing with it, you know. And it was just going, woo, woo, as if it was trying to tell me something. And it kept doing this. But anyway, after a period of time, I felt so close to this being, closer than I do to most human beings, in just, you know, within the space of an hour or two. Anyway, wherever I went, it went. I went to the loo around the corner, it would fly into the bathroom and just watch me have a piss. I'd walk back, fly back, and if I went anywhere in the house, it would fly and follow me. And then at one stage, it flew right across the lounge room, into my studio, into the music room, right under the microphone, where I had a microphone sitting, right? And it started making these extraordinary sounds. So all I had to do was go boff and hit the DAT tape, and it gave me all of its sounds. And all these beautiful sounds. And if any of you have heard my CD, Body of Light, which was called Rainbow Bridge, on track 6 and 7, you'll hear that bird through, because the track 6 was the third eye. It's actually an album of where I do harmonic throat singing for each of the chakras. And it just gave me all of its sounds. And that was extraordinary. And then around about 5 or 6 in the morning, the brew had finished. And so I thought it's bedtime. So I went upstairs. Of course, the owl came upstairs. And so I just got some newspaper that sat on my bed head. And I just put the newspapers down so I could shit if it needed to shit, you know. And I fell asleep. And then every now and then I'd wake up and I'd look up and see if it was still there. And it was hunched down. These owls have this thing where they can do this. And it was hunched down like this. And whenever I'd look, it'd look like that. And then I'd look, I'd close my eyes and go, just back like that. And so we hung there like this. And then in the morning, I went, wow, you know, it's still here, fantastic. I left all the doors and windows open so that it could leave at any time that it wanted. But it stayed. And that night, what was it that night? No, that night, yeah, about midnight again, it flew out into the forest. And I knew it was gone, you know, it was going. And I felt a bit sad, so I was just going, making the sounds, and it came back once more to say goodbye, then it went. And I was telling Russell about this, and you know, he was going, wow, that's amazing, incredible experience, da-da-da-da. And I found out that day, and this is what happens with this medicine, especially when you're doing dieta, the synchronicities start to pile on to an outrageous degree. I found out that the night I was doing the brew was Friday the 13th, it was a blue moon, and it was at midnight that owl came in. And so, like, you know, it was like, okay, right. And so a week later, I decided to test this brew. It's my first brew, right? So I thought I'd test it and try it. And in the meantime, I forgot one aspect. Before he flew off, I was doing this music for this Bundjalung tribe, local Aboriginal people in around Byron Bay, and we were doing this sacred music for them, doing the didge and stuff, and I was recording it for them. And they would just turn up to do the recording. He turned up that day that the gungle was there, well, the owl was there. And I was sitting on my shoulder at the time, and he said, "Where'd that one come from?" And I said, "He flew in yesterday." He said, "That one called Gungle." I said, "Gungle?" I thought, because I knew it as a tawny frogmouth. He said, "Yeah, that one Gungle, that's your totem." I said, "I think so." And he said, "You should call your place Gungle Jindabar," which means, home of the tawny frogmouth. And so now to fast forward again to where I'm just trying the brew for the first time a week later. The brew was great. It was really beautiful. And during it, I kind of transmogrified during the journey into an owl. I had these things growing. I kept going like this. And it was really weird, but it was like little feathers were growing there, And it felt really strange because it was a very tactile thing. It was a really real thing. And that's one of these things with these initiations. They are very real. Like I always thought the Castaneda world was mythological, metaphorical. But it's a real experience. When it happens, it's realer than real. It's realer than this. So anyway, I'm having this thing, I'm feeling these things growing, and I'm coming towards the end of the journey, and up on the balcony, and I had my crystal singing bowl, so I was doing the turning on the bowls, and it just suddenly occurred to me to call the owl. And I'm going Gungle Jindabar, Gungle Jindabar, toning with the bowls, and I kid you not, within a minute there was this right there in front of me, and I thought it was a vision. I thought, and then poof, on my shoulder, there he was. Same thing. Woo, woo, woo. Again, as if he was trying to tell me something. Same thing again. Stayed with me all night, slept with me, stayed all day, and then disappeared around about 6 o'clock. And I'm going, wow, And then I thought, I went to, right, the next thing that happened was the next day, I think, or a day and a half later, I was coming down from another journey of Terence's brew, and I was just lounging upstairs, and I saw Russell, my friend, walking past down below, and when I saw him, I called him, and he tried to hide something, and I said, "What have you got there?" And he didn't want to show me, and I said, come on up, and he showed me, and it was this dead owl. It was dead. And I just burst into tears. And he said, "Oh, it's probably not the same owl." I said, it is. You'll know because she won't be back. And it was still fresh. It wasn't, rigor mortis or anything. It was still pliable. And it was in the middle of the day. Owls are just not out in the middle of the day. He found it right outside on the road. It had been hit by a car. So he said, "I think you should have this." So I'd never done it before, but I took the wings and I buried it and planted an acacia tree over it. And then that night, I took a heroic dose. And I wanted to go in and see what this was all about. And, wow, that journey was something else. I found myself in this place I call Escherland. Escher's drawings? The one of the human face with the ribbons going around like that, and you can see through it into infinity. Well, I realized then that wasn't something that Escher thought of. He'd actually visited these places in the hyperspatial dimensions, in the astral planes, where these things exist. And he very faithfully brought it back. And in his own words, he said that in his 70s, the veils of illusion were lifted from his eyes. Up until then, he'd just been a really great architect, a really great technical artist. But it was only after 76 he started to draw the kind of artwork that he's now famous for. And I saw these places, and it was just extraordinary. I was just streaming energy. There was like perspiration on me. It was just beautiful, ecstatic state. And all of a sudden, out of this incredible ecstatic state, it just went whoa. And it was just like, whoa, something was on me because I was lying on my back. And it was not nice. And I felt, whoa, and I was scared. And I turned my head like this because something was actually pinning me down. And I turned my head in fear, and then there was this wing that went, and voice said, "Don't be afraid, relax. Something really wonderful is happening." And so I just reminded myself that I'm an immortal, eternal being, that nothing can harm me, that all of this is an extrapolation of my own consciousness, and that nothing can harm me. So I just relaxed. And then this thing, as it started to lift, and I realized it was a huge beak over my head, this vision of this creature. It was a great archetypal bird, one that was I couldn't recognize from any birds I'd seen in the third dimensional plane, and yet it seemed to be a combination of several birds. It had this really big head with maroon and purple feathers and gossamer wings like a dragonfly, and scales on its legs and parts of its body. And it started to lift up, and it was as long as I am, as tall as I am. And it started to lift up like that until it was just hovering above me like this. And then it started to turn at 180 degrees like this. And just turn. I'm just watching in sheer astonishment. Turn until the backside of its feathers opened up into this kind of like black hole. It was like this maw, this black opening opened up. It was like an orifice or an anus or a vagina. And the vagina opened up, and I'm just watching, just going, whoa, what, And out of it came this thing. It was like something that had been, it was like a placenta. It was like something that had been wrapped in sausage material. And inside was this kind of like body. And it was like, I couldn't tell what it was. It was coming out and moved very slowly in space towards me, and I could see it in absolute pristine detail. Every detail, it was totally pixelated, and, I was just looking in sheer amazement at this thing. And as it was moving towards me like this, and then it just went in the side of my neck, and then I knew what it was. And then I just went, welcome, welcome. And it was the bird. It was the owl. And what it was doing when it was going woo, 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 so it was telling me that it was coming to help me. It was coming to work with me. And this whole thing happened, and I was just, and the moment it went in there, it was like somebody pulled the plug out of the television. It was like, pew! It was absolutely, all the vision stopped, and instead of streaming energy, I was just suddenly shaking like this. I was really freezing cold. I had to put blankets over me. It took every ounce of jinn energy from my being to effect this act, this movement. It took all the energy, and I later realized that that's why in Dieta they say no sex. It's because the medicine needs that storehouse of energy, of jinn, as they call it in the Taoists, in the martial arts, in order to work with you, in order to effect this kind of initiation, and that's all I could make of it. That's what happened, and I was suddenly cold, as if, sometimes I was practicing Tantra too. You don't ejaculate for a few months, and then when you do, it's like that too. You get really cold, and because of a sudden release of energy. And so then the next day I was just there for an hour, hours, just trying to grok what had happened. And the next day, of course, my mind came in going, that's bullshit, you can't trust that, you don't know, like you're so far out there, you don't know what's real, what's not real. So, and I've always placed a lot of store upon my skeptical part of my mind. I think it's a very useful thing to have, especially when you're deep and journeying onto the depths that I was doing at the time, because you've got no guideline otherwise. And so it's good to have this skeptical mind, even if it's wrong, as a kind of a balance to all of the very highly subjective experiences that you're encountering. So anyway, the next day, while I'm with this, can I trust this? Is this real? Is this just my imagination? I went to a friend's place, and he said, "Oh, I've got this new tarot deck." I said, "Oh, great! What is it?" He said, "It's a tarot deck of the animals, the deck of the animal deck." I went, "Oh, the red American, the Indian ones." And he said, "No, they're Australian ones." I said, "Oh, great, no." So I shuffled them. Then you do the classic thing, you turn them in like that in the U shape with all the backs up. Well, all the backs were up except for right in the middle, up the top, one was turned over, and it was the gungal. And it said the gungal guards the doorway to life and death, and it guards intuition, clairvoyance, and wisdom. And so then I went, okay, no more questions. All right, I trust, And then a series of more and more synchronicities happened with the appearances of other animals, an eagle that turned up, a serpent that I had in my hands, right just days after this, that I was holding, and it was totally beautiful and doing its thing. And it came around and just went poof, and just bit me right here. And I'd never been bitten by a snake, and that was my only fear of snakes, because I quite like snakes. But when it bit me, I just looked at it dispassionately, because again, it was just the morning after a journey. And I just looked at it and went, is that all it is? And the snake just immediately let go. And George, the owner of the snake, is a herpetologist. He collects all this sort of errant snakes in the Byron district when they enter into houses and stuff. He said, wow, that was really auspicious. He said, that snake didn't do that out of anger. That was a love bite. And I said, yeah, I think it was. And you know, like, it was just streaming blood. He hit that vein, and it was just streaming blood. And I just let it bleed, and I picked him up again, and, you know, like, I held him for another hour, never again tried to bite me. That night, I was watching a video that somebody had given me, just at random, and it was about these Mayan shaman kings who would bleed themselves for the benefit of the tribe, and that it was done as an initiation to actually, you know, seal the initiation was the offering of blood. And I've since learned, and I think this is why people, they say that women on their moon time shouldn't drink ayahuasca, is that blood and sperm and bodily fluids actually glow in the astral plane. They're the most highly psychically charged substances on the third dimensional plane. And that's why they were always offered up in offerings in the Old Testament and old times, where they would make blood sacrifices, was because of the potency of this blood. And so that was, again, just part of that. And I realized that the medicine had orchestrated this whole self-initiation. And, you know, because I had nobody to go off. I didn't have any shaman. I didn't have any... And so, like, I started to do groups with people, and the groups were really beautiful, and we're just doing, for the next few years, no more than 5-6 people at a time. And it was, again, teaching me every time. And that went on until I did actually come across a man who could help me, who was able to reflect to me shamanic law. He was able to school me in Amazonian shamanism. And I was led by a series of synchronicities to a man called Don Jose Campos in Peru. And it was my first visit to Peru. And I went and did a series of dietas with him. And on my first dieta, you know, as you all know, the medicine is called La Purga in the jungle, and great emphasis is placed upon this act of purging, of actually throwing up, vomiting. It's like a mini catharsis that cleanses you from all kinds of toxins and all kinds of psychic detritus and all kinds of, you know, physical patterns that no longer serve. Or so anyway, there many ways of purging. One is to throw up, another one is to shit, another one is to sweat. And I started sweating, extremely sweating. Suddenly I was just like in a shower. And he came and did his chakapas and did the singing over me and wiped over this stuff. And I said to him, I know this tea. I know this tea. I said, do you know Terence McKenna? And he said, yes. He said, I'm a good friend of, I'd met Terence. And he said, we both worked with this same shaman, with a teacher who taught how to make the plant. So, because one of my great sadnesses was that after Terence left the body, I thought, God, I never got the recipe from him. And we were in contact, so I could have asked him. I thought, I never got the recipe, but I'd searched through his books and pretty much found how he did it. And but when I found Jose, suddenly he was the man that actually had this very similar medicine, and just with the same potency. And I realize now, in retrospect, that I was very, very fortunate, because this medicine of Terence's was absolutely the best medicine I've ever come across, except for Don Jose's. And I was very, very fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with this medicine for a number of years without realizing how lucky I was, because I hadn't actually tried anyone else's brew. It was only later when I'd made it my intention to find out every context within which ayahuasca was being used on the planet. So after that time, I worked with the Santo Daime, worked with the United Vegetal. I met people in Amsterdam, Jar Levi, Alan Shoemaker. I met people in Brazil. I lived in a community in Brazil for months called Ciranda, which is an ayahuasca community, beautiful community. And a beautiful brother there called Carioca, who's the shaman there, And so he comes from a kind of a lineage of Santo Daime, but found the Santo Daime a little bit restrictive. And so he left that lineage, although he still used all of the songs, all of the devices, all of the contexts, and started his own kind of line. And that's where I resonated very, very much with his work, because it seemed to somehow carry the same frequency of Osho when I was in the ashram. People wore white. It was like a very high frequency, very, very well held, incredibly beautiful people. And, he'd be doing ceremonies with a lot of people. Up until this time, I'd only been working with, 9, 10, 12 people max. And he was doing them with up to, 60, 80 people, but really extraordinary, really, really beautiful. And he'd have like a band of musicians, excellent musicians, holding the space with the music. And so I lived there and studied under him and worked with him, and that was an extraordinary period of my life, and also very, very formative. And later I traveled with him to Israel, to Costa Rica, and to many other countries, where we were holding, amazing ceremonies, like in the Sinai desert, with up to, I think it was 180 people in concentric circles in the desert under the full moon. It was just unbelievable. And then later on, we were doing them in Switzerland, where he would be doing a ritual called the Kura, which is a 3-day ritual where you drink 18 cups in 3 days, and you barely sleep, and you're just singing and dancing the whole time. And they, of course, allowed the use of Santa Maria, which is marijuana, in the ceremony, which a lot of the jungle shamans totally eschew. They say, no, no, no. And I often said to them, why? And I said to Don Jose, I said, why not? And he says, because they're both feminine plants and they get jealous of each other. Which may be true, but I must say that for most of my life, marijuana has been a lifelong lover with me, and although I use it infrequently now, for many, many years, and especially at that time, I did use it a lot, and I didn't find any contraindication between the two. However, when I was with Don Jose, I totally and utterly respected his way and did not smoke during the period of times of the dieta or any times that I drank with him. Because I think that, people have, that brings me to the point of belief systems, that many, many different ways of doing ayahuasca. I was working with people who were doing Umbanda ceremonies, like they're a kind of a candomblé bleu voodoo extraction, where they're working with the Haitian luas, the gods and goddesses and devas of that tradition, and quite strong, and seeing what the controlled incorporation, what they call incorporation or spirit possession of beings, of sometimes the shaman himself, or sometimes people within the group, being held by very, very strong drumming. Absolutely amazing. Not really my styley, but very, very happy to have experienced it. And so, like, what I found was that through all of these different ways, and I then drank with many, many other shamans in the jungle as well. And, I could go all night telling stories about my experiences, but the point I want to make is that what I come to understand out of this is that ayahuasca has no face. She takes on the attributes of the cup into which she is poured. So if you're pouring it into a Santo Daime cup, yes, you may well see Jesus, Mary, and the apostles. If you're coming from the shamanic tradition in the jungles, yes, you probably see snakes and jaguars and more within the cosmology and the kind of symbology within their working, within which they are working. Now, there are certain generic visions that I'm sure go right across the board, but I'm talking about the belief system and the context within which it's held, the set and setting, in other words, has a very, very strong influence upon it. And so when I started to work with it, the medicine said, just be authentic. Simply be true to yourself and to your own knowledge and to your own understanding. So although I'd already met, Don Jose, and he'd schooled me in Icaros, in the Amazonian shamanism, I realized that I was actually working not with Indian people, working within the Indian kind of conditioning, but I was working with Western people with a Western psychology, with a Western understanding of the Western consciousness. And so I started to use influences from various teachers that I'd had. And there was another teacher I had in Ibiza called Yatra Silveira de Barbosa, who also comes from the Santo Daime tradition, and another amazing lady. And she introduced me to Jurema, which is the Mimosa hostilis plant, which is an extraordinary additive to the ayahuasca brew. And so I want to explore all of these plants. So for 2 years or 3 years, I only used Mimosa hostilis, and we worked with that. So I really got to understand that plant. And then for a couple of years, I only used the yahe, which is the Diplopterus cabrerana, as an additive to the ayahuasca, and I was getting that from Alan Shoemaker, and that was very good quality, and very beautiful, and interesting in itself because it has the 5-MeO additive within that plant. It's not just DMT, it's 5-MeO DMT, which gives experience a kind of a more somatic sense of flight. And throughout Ecuador and Colombia, they tend to favour the use of this additive as opposed to the traditional Psychotria viridis, which is known as chacruna. So, and then after that, I started using the acacias. Of course, the chacruna was always being used, but I started exploring Acacia phlebophylla, which had pretty much the same DMT concentration as Psychotria viridis. Started then using Acacia obtusifolia, which is unique unto itself because there's not just a straight DMT component, there's a whole cocktail of tryptamines in the Acacia obtusifolia. You have like DMT, 5-MeO DMT, you have monomethyltryptamine, MMT, NMT, you have buffertonine. So what you're getting with these trees is not just, because they're a whole laboratory and a whole mystery school unto themselves. It's not just DMT you're getting a whole cocktail of tryptamines, which you can only truly say is the tree. It's not DMT, it's the tree. And the tree is absolutely extraordinary, and that's where we started to create this whole idea of, well, this is an Australian version of ayahuasca. This is an analogue which is unique to this country and carrying the frequency of this land. It's carrying the vibration, the lineage, the memories of this very, very ancient land, and had been used by the indigenous peoples without a doubt for at least 50,000 years, if not more. And so, these were amazing times exploring these acacias, and then we came across, of course, Acacia acuminata, which by large is the most potent of all. It's, up until then, the Mimosa hostilis root bark contained 1% of DMT within the bark. But suddenly here, with the Acacia acuminata, we had 2% in the bark, in the root bark, and 1% in the phyllodes, which are the leaves of the acacia. And so this was it was just pure DMT. So we've been using that a lot. And although recently I've gone right back to the traditional brew. And for the last year or so, I've just been using the Psychotria viridis and the acacia, the Banisteropsis carpi. But nonetheless, the mystery school of each of these plants is amazing. I mean, to a lay person, you probably wouldn't notice the difference between them because it's an ayahuasca experience, a generic experience. However, when you start to work with them very closely, you do feel the differences, the nuances. They're like filters, different ones carrying different vibrations and can be used in different ways and contexts. So amazing, to really explore one by one all these plants. And now, having done that, when I brew, I can use any one of these plants. Sometimes in the brew I might use up to 6 different plants, including the additives that I've mentioned up to date. Because having worked with them individually, one gets to know exactly dosages and how much to use, but also to get to know your plants. It's a relationship with the plants. It's not just an alkaloid. You really got to get to know your plant, because particularly the acacias of a particular species may be different if they grow in the valley or up on a hill or 100 kilometres away. The actual concentration of the alkaloids can differ widely and vary greatly. So I learnt to just use the plant, relate to a certain tree, and use just that tree or trees, and not to vary, because then you get to know that one, just like you get to know a person, just like you get to know anybody or anything. And so then, you could use with impunity any number of these additives. So from there, what happened? Oh, I later also met a man called Don Casimiro Mamayacta in Ecuador, an amazing man. He's a Shwa Indian man. He doesn't sing Icaros, but he does incredible limpias. And the limpias are the cleanses that the shamans do on ayahuasca. They use the chicapa and they use various ways of extracting, unwanted elements within the body, mind, spirit. And he's a wonderful man. I met him when he was 78, and he was just starting to learn the violin. And he's now 87 and plays the violin really well. And these beings, these guys, have an incredible dominion over their environment through the medicine. Because remember, the medicine, ayahuasca, in the ancient traditions of the jungle, were used to get to know the jungle, to know where the monkeys were in the forest that they wanted to hunt, to know how to heal, to know what other plants, what they were good for in terms of healing. They were used for divination. They were even used for battle and for warfare. So the dominion that these practitioners have over their environment is extraordinary. And the level of telepathy and spiritual understanding of the way they work with people and the work with the tribe is quite extraordinary. Because when I went there to meet him the first time, I had my friend who was Marcos, who was the translator, because he spoke only Quechua or Spanish, and I didn't speak Spanish well. And I said, don't tell him I do ceremonies, and don't tell him I just want to go and drink with this man, And so he drank with me, and that night he used this substance, and it was an incense that he used to cleanse us. I thought, wow, that's amazing. I've got to find out what that is. I must ask him in the morning what that is. And, we slept for a couple of hours. In the morning he came striding across the compound, put this lump into my hand. It looked like petrified wood or something. And he said, put a ceremonia. He said, for your ceremonies. And he gave me this stuff that I was only thinking, I must ask him what that is. So there's amazing dominion. Another time I remember Don Jose Campos in the jungle, of the dominion they have over their environment, where he looked at me, and there was no ego in this. He was just teaching me something. And he picked up a sopla, which is this kind of like drink, which is like a psychic antiseptic. It's not a drink, it's a spray. They used to spray to cleanse the space. And he picked it up and went, and he looked at me and then did that. And then in the distance you could hear wee coming through the forest, this sound. And it was like something snaking through the forest. And it came through, and it was like this wind and rain, but it was only like from here to the edge of the tent wide. It was rain, but it was just like a snake of rain with wind. And it came snaking through the jungle, and this is in a daytime session, and went around the Malacca like this. And then went off into the jungle again. And then it's just drip, 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 and the whole Malacca had been cleansed. And you're just going, what the fuck was that? Amazing. And that's the kind of thing. And another day I said to him, because he said he told a story where he said he's a jaguar, and he was having a vision of a jaguar one day in the forest, and he opened up his eyes, and there was a jaguar in front of him, and I showed him my ring, and I said, I'm a Sachamama. The serpent is my totem. And I said, do you ever see serpents around? He said, nah, not much, not hardly ever. No boas, no. Anyway, I went back to my tumbo, which was the furthest tumbo away, and just sitting in my hammock, just meditating. And then from this tree, I saw this massive serpent, this boa, just literally dive into the water right in front of me, go, and it was big, from here to the end of the tent away. So he'd sent me that serpent too, just so that I could have a look at that. You know what I mean? These guys are really connected through the medicine to their environment. Absolutely extraordinary. Anyway, yeah. Where to take this now? So, okay, that was my formative years, and that was how it started, and the kind of experiences that really brought me onto this path. And when I came on this path, and the very first journey I had, I forgot about that. That's right. The very first journey that I took was after a 10-day a fast, and I took it, and I'd always thought, well, I tried all psychedelics, and but suddenly there was this thing that I could feel this intelligence entering into me that was different from acid, different from mushrooms, and different from anything I'd ever tried, and she showed me, gifted me in this session, what the medicine was coming to do in the West. She showed me that it was coming to actively work with a shift in consciousness that we all know is happening, which is experiencing today, which we're right in the middle of, coming towards the peak of, and that it was playing a very, very special role in that, and that it was actually here to recalibrate DNA. And I think it was Dan or Rack that mentioned yesterday about the doctrine of signatures. And when you think about it, you know, like when you look at a walnut, it's good. It looks like a brain, and it's actually good for the brain. Kidney beans look like the kidneys. It's actually good for the kidneys. Well, the ayahuasca looks like the DNA spiral. And in fact, that's what it does. It can unlock the phylogenetic memories within the DNA and show us. And it was showing me through this mechanism that it gave me an experience of what was in real time maybe only about 20 minutes, but it seemed like an eternity, of this incredible gift that's happening on this planet right now. It showed me that there's these people that I call the programmers who go around the galaxy seeding planets with life, seeding it with DNA. And that just like when you seed plants in a garden, some grow, some don't. If it falls on stony soil, it doesn't grow. And some actually grow and flower. And it was saying that planet Earth is about to flower in consciousness. And that ayahuasca was coming to play a role within that. It was coming to heal the schism that we have experienced in the West, this split between man and nature, between the left brain and the right brain, between God and man. And that it was coming to re-invite Western consciousness back into the garden, back into the Eden, welcome it back home. And it showed me the state of consciousness, which I can only describe, for want of a better word, as an enlightened state, a state of oneness. And that this was going to be a predominant experience for the planet in the coming times. And that we had to move through a kind of a transitional period which would involve great purging. Just as on the medicine we purge and we have a catharsis, that the planet was about to go through a major catharsis, and that the other side of this catharsis was like a rebirthing, a re-emergence of something very ancient. And it was this consciousness. And at the time that I experienced it, I thought, wow, what an incredible birthday present for human consciousness. This is something unprecedented. This is something, there is no account. There's nothing to measure it by. And so when I experienced that, I thought, that's where you're going? Okay, I'm in. I'm your hands, my feet, my consciousness is yours. For this, I'm in. I don't need to know how we're going to get there. Now that I've seen where we're going, I'm in. Just give me the next step, and I'll do that to the best of my ability. And when I've done that, give me the best next step, and I'll do that to the best of my, so on. And I can say after 18 years of working with this medicine, I look back and I just go, wow, what an amazing path. What a path full of magic and mystery and empowerment and extraordinary unfolding that I would not have had the courage or the temerity to imagine or to even undertake if it had been up to me. But fortunately, since having that experience, I don't make plans too much. I just wait for the instructions and follow instructions. And I think any shamanic practitioner, in a sense, is doing that. It's just following instructions. Any projection of glamour or special person or anything like that is just bullshit. Basically, a shaman follows instructions, good soldier, and does the job, and is there for the people in service. It's not something I would have elected to do personally, because it's a hell of a thing. And you have to wear a lot of shit, and you have to go through a lot of shit, and you get tested all the time. And it's not something you would undertake lightly or even wish for yourself. But when it's just swept up and given to you, you have no choice but to surrender. And you just go into service and you say, okay, I'm here to do that. And whilst there are many, many other modalities besides the medicine which are helping to affect this great transition, this great shift in consciousness, certainly I could say that ayahuasca is playing a great role, because when Terence started to talk about it all those years ago, 20 years ago or whatever, or even 25 years ago, no one had ever heard of it really. No one really knew about ayahuasca. And yet today it's everywhere in the West. You can find it in Time magazine, in National Geographic, in most newspapers, on the net, of course. And in almost virtually every country there are practitioners now. And I can say that I was one of those pioneers that started to bring it to Europe, about 14 years ago. And since that time, I've seen the proliferation of so many practitioners working with the medicine. And certainly all the churches, as well as the more traditional ones. Then you have the hybrid ones, like the Red Path, which are mixing the Red Indian traditions with the South American Indian traditions. As I say, all good. You know, I don't make any judgment about whether this way is better or that way is better, because it's all the medicine. And all the medicine really asks for is that a safe space is held, that certain conditions are held. You know, that you hold the space safely, and that the medicine is given maximum possibility to be able to be worked with. And then you can believe what you like around that, what belief system you want to put into that. Can you please let me know when I'm getting close to the things?
Yeah, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, because I could go on for ages. And I think that that's what's happening. She's playing an incredible role in the unfolding of consciousness, of this new consciousness, particularly in the West, where she herself is evolving, just as we are evolving. Gaia herself is evolving on every level, and every aspect of Gaia, of this multidimensional entity called Gaia, is unfolding. And so, like, you know, you have like the levels of the human level, which is what we are, just walking, talking, cogitating, self-aware aspects of that one being, of that one consciousness called Gaia. And this is what I think the medicine is opening us up to, is reintroducing us back into that kind of multidimensional awareness. And she's showing us that way through the heart. Traditionally, it's been working through this chakra, the power chakra, which was knowledge, shamanic knowledge in the jungle. And the jungle is still rife with all kinds of battling between shamans. And really, I've had very little time for that myself, because I feel it's the old school, because it's still working within duality, within the light and the dark. And there are very, very dark aspects of ayahuasca, as well as light aspects, which I could talk upon at great length. However, I feel that these dark aspects are being integrated, that we're being asked to accept the shadow and reintegrate the shadows into ourselves, and stop projecting that outward onto other beings, or onto other situations or other events, and to take responsibility for who we are on every level. And that means owning our shadow. That means owning the victim, the killer, the misery, all of the stuff that we want to chuck out onto someone else, terrorism, all of that. It's like George Bush going, terrorists, terrorists. You only have to turn the figure to see who's the true terrorists. And I think what ayahuasca is showing us is to take full responsibility for ourselves through the heart. And that, but in so doing, we become whole. And that's where the word healing comes from, being whole, holing, becoming whole. And that comes from taking full responsibility. And that we need to move through this portal of new consciousness. And that we can't take these fractured, disowned, unvalidated aspects of our own being through that portal. We need to bring them firmly home. And I think that's what the medicine is doing. And as part of the catharsis of the purge, is that she's opening us to all of those unconscious aspects of our own being and bringing them into the light of awareness for our loving consideration and for our acceptance of these aspects of our being. And I believe that if every person is willing and able to do that, we'll stop seeing terrorism, we'll stop seeing child abuse, we'll stop seeing sexual abuse, we'll stop seeing abuse of every kind. Because that is all a result of throwing out and of abrogating responsibility onto others. And I think in this way, ayahuasca is an incredibly powerful tool, psychotherapeutic tool for the West at this time. And that's why I think that she's opening up in new modalities outside of the traditional ways of the jungle. And it's not just the jungle where she's appeared. She's appeared in other mystery schools in the past, like the Mithraic mystery school traditions of Persia, the Zoroastrian mystery schools, the ancient Soma, which I believe was also an analogue of ayahuasca, although some people believe it was a mushroom and others believe it was an ergo. But I think it could well have been, because in the Middle East there was a thing called haoma, which is Peganin hamala, which is Syrian rue, which has all of the same beta-carboline alkaloids as the Banisteropsis carpi. And all they needed to do was add a tryptamine additive, and we would have had an analogue ayahuasca. And I believe the Egyptian mystery schools had these acacias. I believe that Moses and Dr. Benny Shannon from Tel Aviv University, he's a professor of clinical psychology there, has actually done a paper stating that he believes that the acacia was used with the haoma, which actually, if you think about it, is not far of a semantic shift to soma, as being, having had widespread use within the Middle East. And so I think that these alkaloids, these brews, these beverages, these neurotransmitters have been with us since time immemorial. And that most recently we're taking it from the jungle, but that it's come, and these plants, these neurotransmitters, these alkaloids exist in a plethora of different plants, animals, insects, minerals, across the board. So, it seems that these neurotransmitters are so tuned to the human nervous system, to the human biology, to the hormonal system in our body, that we create these things endogenously within our own body. We have pinealine and DMT within the pineal gland, and that people have done dark room experiments where people go into dark room for 21 days start to produce their own endogenous ayahuasca. And in fact, according to the Rick Strassman, for up to 3 days after clinical death, the pineal extrudes this cocktail of tryptamines, and that this assists the leaving of the spirit from the body, the animating force from the body. And isn't it interesting that in these times of great change, where the Schumann resonance has gone from 7.2 right up to 12 or 13 hertz, and the electromagnetic fields of the planet seem to be lowering, and these are the things that affect consciousness and that keep us within the narrow bandwidth of the 3D space-time. As these things shift, so do we shift, so does consciousness shift. And in fact, something I've just pondered upon, that I don't have any scientific evidence for, but just look at as a possibility, is that perhaps what people call the ascension, in New Age, which is perhaps, if these electromagnetic fields are greatly affected by something like a pole shift, it could that we get an endogenous release of these tryptamines, of these neurotransmitters from the pineal, which could give us a taste of multidimensional awareness or of an enlightened experience, and that if enough people on the planet had that experience, perhaps it could help carry through many, many other people and the collective. It's just something to think about, because this is something that is actually happening to every person at birth and death. These same neurotransmitters are intimately connected with birth, death, and peak experience, like samadhi, orgasm, satori. And so, it's an interesting thing to just ponder, that perhaps as we move through these dimensions, as the veils are lifted, as these new frequencies are being ingressed into us as willing anchors to hold them in the third dimensional plane, that in fact that is perhaps part of the miracle, part of the mystery that has always been there, that is across the board in nature, is that these neurotransmitters mirrored in these plants, mirrored in our body, are actually intimately involved in the evolution of human consciousness, not just human consciousness, but the consciousness of Gaia, of this planet. And that in fact ayahuasca is an evolutionary driver, or that these substances are evolutionary drivers. I'd just like to leave you with that thought, and thank you very, very much for listening. And I'd like to also just leave you with one other quote from Terence McKenna, where he says that the last best hope for dissolving the steep walls of cultural inflexibility that appears to be channeling us toward true ruin is a renewed shamanism, a renewed spirit, a renewed spiritual of a society that has become bereft of spiritual meaning. Thank you.
Thanks, Darpan.